want to always remind us to come back to this question of what's best for all students. I apologize for any weird little things like my all being moved because I had to change for the program I'm using today at the very last minute. And I didn't get to catch all the errors that happened in the shift of going from PowerPoint to Google Slides. Sorry about that. Though, we are actually going to start with a breakout group to kind of focus on a little bit of what you may have read over break. And I want to remind you, if someone could please take on that role of facilitator and move us through different people in the group. Someone else take the role of timekeeper and speak up for moving the time along, and that all participate and be engaged. So our very first question, and I think it's a really important one, and I know it's a little bit convoluted here. It comes direct from the book. What impact does being judged for every mistake, being awarded points for their actions, and being faced with complex and variable grading have on students' motivation to learn? I'm going to try to just review some of the concepts from the reading fairly quickly because I know some people did the reading and some people weren't able to. I mean, for those of us who turned off over Christmas and tried to do anything, kudos to you. But then it adds some stress this week. I know it did for me. So in the chapter 5, he talks about traditional grading practices and how it makes students feel. And so I'm hoping some of these things came up in your conversations. He mentions things like the kids feeling constantly judged with points being added and subtracted for everything every day through multiple classes. Sorry about that. And that they are confused, and the grading is complex from teacher to teacher, especially as they get into middle or high school, and the grading is so complex from teacher to teacher. They're feeling overloaded because there's too much to figure out with each teacher grading differently, and they're feeling defined by a single grade when they get to that point. And I just want to emphasize this point. Kids are feeling defined by a single grade when we use letter grades particularly. This is a picture of my older sister and I. We're 2 years apart. And there was a point in school where I was getting grades and she wasn't. So I was like the A student and she was the D student. And so my sister decided that she's dumb and I decided I was smart. And that sort of became our role and our definition. And it took a very, very long time for her to realize that she's not dumb. And for me to realize that I'm not the smartest kid, you know, all things. When we do this when we grade the way that we currently do, and our kids get these grades, whether they're letter grades or you're not yet proficient, the grade says to a kid, I'm dumb. And these kids then think, I will avoid doing the things that remind me of this. I don't want to be reminded that I'm dumb with these grades, so I'm going to avoid it. And that creates that fixed mindset of just not doing it and thinking I'm not good at this, so therefore I'm not going to do it because it makes me feel bad. These students become disengaged and they become disempowered. The grade also, on the other end of it, for those kids with the high grades like me, the grade tells them, well, I'm smart, proves that I'm smart, and I'm going to do whatever I need to do. I'm going to play the game, as one of my friends in my breakout room said, I'm going to play this game of school and I'm going to be good at it. And I will do whatever it takes, even maybe some cheating to get the grade I need. Students become so motivated to do what they need to do for the grade instead of to learn and grow and improve. And that too is a fixed mindset, just like on the other end. So in this chapter 2, he talks about the difference between performance goals and mastery goals. He says that success in performance goals is based on demonstrating competence in others' eyes. Do others think I did well? Did my teacher like what I wrote? Versus mastery goals, where he says that success is based on a student's own evaluation of whether she reaches some external standard. Have I learned? Have I improved? He said that research has found that students define these goals in large part based on their learning environment. We as teachers influence whether students see academic success as a mastery or performance goal, and we therefore influence how they behave and respond to the tasks we give them, which in turn affects their likelihood of success. We influence how students behave in response to the tasks we give them. And I do want to take a little detour about this term mastery, because even with standards-based or proficiency-based, we're seeing this term mastery, and I've struggled with that. Like if I create a rubric and mastery is this far right column, what is mastery? To me, like I write, I'm an English teacher, I'm a writer, I have an article published or 2 or 3. Am I a master? No, I don't feel like I've mastered writing. There's so much more to learn. And so when I have my ninth grade students making it to the mastery column, what is that saying to them? But I have rethought mastery. I was listening to this book called The Rise by Sarah Lewis, and she was describing it in this way. Mastery requires endurance. Mastery, a word we don't use often, of what we might consider its cognate, perfectionism, an inhuman aim motivated by a concern how others view us. Mastery is also not the same as success, an event-based victory based on a peak point, a punctuated moment in time. Mastery is not merely a commitment to a goal, but to a curved line, constant pursuit. And I really like the idea of constant pursuit. Like you are achieving mastery when you realize you still have more to learn and you want to learn it. So where do we go from here? With is we've got to figure out how to minimize the negative impact on learning. And the question is, how can we minimize traditional grading's negative impact on learning, particularly for vulnerable student populations? We need to expand education equity. How can we use grading to expand rather than limit educational equity and achievement in our schools? And finally, we've got to reimagine grading to be something that encourages our students. So how can we instead reimagine grading to encourage rather than undermine effective teaching and learning? So Feldman sets up the rest of his book, and you're really gonna get into the good stuff after these webinars with me, where you're really looking deeply at three pillars: a pillar about accurate grades, a pillar about bias resistant grades, and a pillar about motivational grades. And so in the accurate pillar, grades would validly reflect the student's academic progress with certain practices. Bias resistant, the way that you grade, your grading practices would prevent biased subjectivity from affecting grades. And in the motivational pillar, academic success and perseverance is what is valued and encouraged and helps motivate kids. So in the accurate pillar, again, you're going to get so much deeper into this later. So this is just a quick overview. But he says that our grading must use calculations that are mathematically sound and correctly describe students' level of academic performance. The key idea here is that our grading practices make it easy for students to understand their learning. And I just want to tell you about a couple of stories about some students that have helped me change my practice. And this is the very first student that made me go, wait a minute, the way that I grade, the way I learned to grade from my teachers and the teachers before them isn't really showing what this kid can do. Is I had a student who was deaf and he had a full-time aide and he was a hard worker. He did everything, but he had the lowest skills in reading and writing that I'd ever seen. But he did everything and he got help with everything. So what he was turning into me was passable, was proficient. So he got, I think he ended with a B in my class because I gave points for everything he did all along the way. He got a B. But then they realized he needed extra support and they needed to put him in our special ed program. And how did my grade of a B tell whether he could or couldn't do the skills? So how we grade, I realized at that point how I was grading wasn't reflecting whether he could or couldn't do the skills. It was reflecting that he was a hard worker and he had a lot of support. Last year, I had a student who came in at the beginning of the year, an English language learner, and she really had minimal skills, wouldn't speak well, didn't write much. And if I graded like I traditionally graded, where everything that we're doing from the beginning of the year forward is getting points and going in the grade book, she would have been failing. Her growth from the beginning of the semester to the end of the semester was amazing. What she could do by the end of that first semester was incredible. But if I graded like I traditionally would have graded, she would have failed or barely passed because I would have had all of these negative points for when she wasn't doing things versus grading more could actually do. In the accuracy pillar, he talks about that it's important. These are actually the practices that you're going to learn more about. And one is avoiding zeros. It's very controversial, but it's super interesting. This idea of minimum grading, using a 0 to 4 point scale, which I know some of you do. Weighting more recent performance, so like I was talking about with that student a second ago, and grades based on an individual's achievement, not the groups. Then the bias resistant pillar, he talks about grades being based on valid evidence of a student's content knowledge and not based on evidence that is likely to be corrupted by teachers' implicit bias or reflecting a student's environment. And I know we don't want to think that we are biased, but we do have some biases. So that these practices that you'll learn about later, they value knowledge, not environment or behavior. So one thing I know that I learned about myself early on in my teaching was that I had a bias towards the girls in my classroom. And I actually would be sitting there grading papers and I'd look at this girl who was so well behaved and she wrote a paper and I gave her a pretty decent grade. It was a decent enough paper who was like a thorn in my side, adolescent male, loud, obnoxious, running over, poking, punching his friends all the time. And when I did his paper, which might have been exactly the same, I gave him a little bit lower grade. And that wasn't fair. I let my personal bias get in the way. And I learned later that it was not understanding the difference between how boys and girls at that particular age behaved, but I actually let that affect my grading. So it was important for me to learn about that bias that I had. Another thing is not just your bias towards gender or race, but also like our bias towards their environment. You know, there are some kids who do not have the same environment as others at home, and we expect them to do this work. They are at home. I have a baby who only has half its brain, and she's got this baby on her lap, bouncing him in the middle of the Zoom class. And how is she supposed to get my writing done when she's taking care of this baby at home in the middle of the Zoom class? And then another student I have was going home and having to take care of his mother, who had, I believe she had cerebral palsy, but there were times that he came home and he had to pick his mom up off the floor. And he didn't care about what I was assigning in class or wasn't ready to learn that. So when I set up my learning experiences for my kids, am I thinking about the environment that they have to deal with outside of my classroom as part of their grade? So when we're thinking about the bias resistant pillar, you're going to be learning about grading practices that are based on required content, not extra credit, that are based on student work, not the timing of the work, late work, there's alternative non-grade consequences for cheating that don't impact their grade, excluding participation and effort, which is hard when you've been doing that for a long time in your career. And giving grades that are based entirely on summative assessments, not formative, like giving points for everything they're doing, the homework and the classwork throughout. In the motivational pillar, he's going to talk about academic success, support a growth mindset, and give opportunities for redemption. Don't we all need that right now? Prizes that are going to support hope and a growth mindset, practices that will lift the veil where the targets for academic success are clear and explicit, practices that build soft skills without including them in the grade. And we'll talk a little bit about motivation. This is actually a picture of my son who was not motivated by grades. He had some learning disabilities and he was pretty frustrated. And there was a point where one of his teachers gave him an F+. I'm not even kidding you. 9th grade science. She gave him an F+. And I had to go in and talk to that teacher because I'd never heard of an F+ before to find out why she gave him an F+. And she said, well, I wanted him to be encouraged. So I gave him the plus. That didn't encourage my son. Not at all. So we have to think about what kind of practices we can do besides just giving points, giving grades to motivate. So he's going to talk about in the later chapters, minimum grading and a 0 to 4 scale, renaming grades, retakes and redos, creating a community of feedback, using rubrics, student trackers, emphasizing self-regulation, and giving grades that are based on standard scales, not points. Whew. All right, that was my fast overview of that chapter. So another breakout. This one's going to be about 10 minutes, but thinking about these 3 pillars, the accurate pillar, the bias resistant pillar, and the motivational pillar, and thinking about yourself and your own practices, or if you are an administrator, think about the practices when you were a teacher, or think about some of your current teachers. And think about which pillar confirms your teaching or the teaching of the group that you have at your school. Which one most confirms what people are doing? Which pillar most challenges your web of belief? Which one might be a little bit harder? And then finally, which pillar seems most pressing based on the students that you have and the situation that we're in right now. So that's the kind of the conversation that I'd like you to have with your, I want to, okay, got that closed, good. I want to share this quote from this book that I read called The End of Average. Really fascinating look at how we came up with this idea, how we constructed the idea of average over time. I may have mentioned this book before, and that average isn't, there is no average, but yet we use that all the time in schools and grades. He says late in the book that our task is developing them, referring to students, not ranking and sorting them, to help our children become the best version of themselves. And when I think about how I teach and when I'm looking at my grading practices and how that affects them and or encourages them, that's what it's about. How do I help my kids become the best version of themselves? So for me, as I started to look at my grading practices, my focus has been on learning, not on grades. I've realized over the last year that I want to be the teacher as the guide, not the judge and jury. So I've been looking at focusing on learning over points, looking at focusing on competence versus compliance. Are they turning everything in for me? And also how I can use my grading to show growth versus just grades. So a little bit more about things I've been trying with learning versus points. And this is after having read Grading for Equity and some other books and other articles. Now I'm trying conversing with students about their learning and growth and coming up with a grade together. I'm focusing on giving them feedback, not points for formative learning. So they are not getting any points in my grade book for the formative work we're doing. And I'm collecting evidence of their learning and they're collecting evidence of their learning. And we're using that in the grade book instead of points to come up with a final grade. For competence versus compliance, I have not been giving any type of grade penalties at all for the past year and a half, like taking out points for late work or other things. I've ditched the zero. I don't put zeros into their grades. I have tried entering a 50% with a comment that says need to submit, because there's a big gap between a 0 to a 60 if you're on a 100-point scale like my school is. So between an A and a B, it's 10%. Between a B and a C, it's 10%. Between a C and a D, it's 10%. Between a D and an F, it's a giant jump down to 0. It's 60% or more at my school. A D is a 70. So you have a D at 70%, and if you have an F, you have 0. That is a big gap to try to fill. So I put a 50% in with a comment need to submit instead of a 0. And that's been really interesting how that has motivated students who weren't motivated before. And I'm doing grades for summative work only, not formative. And then thinking about growth versus grades, things I've been experimenting with. I have students set expectations for their growth at the beginning. I have been really interested in learning about John Hattie's self-reported grades, which has an effect size of 1.44, which is like triple growth if you can get your kids invested and working with you and self-evaluating how they meet the standards at the beginning of a unit and coming back to that in the middle and then looking at it at the end. It isn't really about that they're reporting their grade for the report card. Then having students reflect on their learning, the metacognition, the ability to really think about what they've learned, that's what helps them transfer that learning. And collaborating with students to determine a grade for grade checks. We have grade checks halfway through the quarter and then a final grade. So I'm working with them to collaborate on what their will be. And I have not been putting grades in until those 2 points this particular year. So my call to action was how can I shift the way I grade to focus on learning and growth? And again, focusing on feedback that moves learning forward. What I'm wondering is, what's your call to action? And I told you about some of the kids that I've experienced that have made me rethink the way I grade. So what's your call to action? Why are you here? Why is this important to you? And what or who is motivating this for you? I'd like you to share that in groups right now. The biggest question I get as I start looking at grading practices, and I know it was for me too, is how do we change others? Like as I started to see that some of the grading practices I had learned really weren't fair and equitable to my kids, I wanted to change everyone else too. And that couldn't happen fast enough for me. And it was frustrating. And I know some of you may feel that same frustration too. How do we get other people to change and for the benefit of kids, because this is about what's best for our students. So I want to show you this video that helped me understand better why I can't just talk them all into changing. So we're going to watch a video just for fun. No, because I think it's pretty interesting. Here we go. Getting it up on full screen here. I'm not muted. It's all good. Here we go.
Stop. Wait. You're not going to believe what I'm about to tell you. I'm going to tell you some things. You're not going to believe these things I tell you. And that's okay. You have good reason not to. But I need you to keep listening regardless of what you believe. I don't care if you're liberal, conservative, or somewhere in between. I don't care if you're a cat person, a dog person, or a tarantula person. Morning person or night owl, iPhone, Android, Coke, or Pepsi, I don't care. All I care about is that you read this to the end. Sound good? Then let's begin. You may have heard that George Washington had wooden teeth. He lost most of his teeth in his 20s and had a set of dentures made out of wood. It's a disturbing visual. The founding father, commander-in-chief, and first president of the United States click-clacking his way through a ham sandwich. Except it isn't true. In 2005, at the National Museum of Dentistry in Baltimore, laser scans were performed on Washington's 200-year-old dentures and found them to be made of gold, lead, hippopotamus ivory, horse, and donkey teeth. His mouth was a petting zoo of nightmares. Upon learning this information, I want to ask you something. How did it feel to learn this new fact about George Washington's teeth? I stated a thing, I provided evidence of that thing, and presumably you now believe the thing I stated. Presumably, your belief in the composition of George Washington's teeth has changed with little or no friction. Presumably, the next time you're at a party and George Washington's teeth come up in conversation, you're going to proudly impart this newfound knowledge to your fellow partygoers. Yes? Terrific, let's continue. What if I told you George Washington had another set of false teeth? What if I told you the other set wasn't made from wood, ivory, or any of the aforementioned materials? What if I told you it was made from the teeth of slaves? Now, let's try this again. How did it feel to learn this fact about George Washington? Any more of that friction I mentioned earlier? Before we go any further, allow me to reiterate. I am not here to convince you that George Washington was a bad person. I could go through all my cited sources and cherry-pick arguments that either deify or demonize George Washington. I could paint a portrait of a monster, or I could exonerate a patriot. But as I said before, I don't care. It's not the point. The point is to give you an emotional barometer of how you feel when presented with new ideas. Because you may have noticed that the first fact about George Washington's teeth was rather easy to accept. I would even wager that when I told you the first fact, you accepted it without question. But when I told you the second fact, you immediately checked my sources and are now furiously composing an informed yet incendiary retort which you will boldly deliver to me in the form of a sour, blustering Facebook comment. And that's okay. That's all part of it. Let's try a few more. Napoleon Bonaparte was not short. He was 5'7", which is taller than the average Frenchman of the time. Thomas Crapper did not invent the flush toilet, nor did the word crap come about because of his name. Houseflies live for about a month, not 24 hours. Humans don't explode in a vacuum, nor do we boil. We just pass out from lack of oxygen and then we die. Again, as you read these facts, take stock of how you feel. I'm guessing you softened to the last few fairly easily. Let's try a few more and then we're done. There is zero evidence that Jesus Christ was born on December 25th. The Pledge of Allegiance was written by a socialist. 6 of the 7 justices who voted in favor of Roe v. Wade were Republican appointed. How'd those last 3 feel? Depending on your beliefs, at the very least, you can concede that it felt different to hear those statements compared to the ones about Napoleon or houseflies. Yes? But why? Why do we easily soften to some ideas but not to others? Why do we gnash our teeth when presented with evidence counter to our beliefs? Why do we not only ignore this evidence but dig our heels in deeper and believe more strongly in the opposing argument? Why would providing more evidence make someone less likely to believe in an idea? It seems backwards and bat-bum crazy bonkers to me. It turns out bat-bum crazy bonkers is a name in the world of neuroscience. It's called the backfire effect, and it's a well-documented psychological behavior. A few years ago at the University of Southern California's Brain and Creativity Institute, a study was conducted where participants were placed into an MRI machine. And once inside, they're presented with counter-arguments to strongly held political beliefs. A few examples. Laws restricting gun ownership should be made more restrictive. Gay marriage should not be legalized. As participants or read these counter-arguments, various parts of their brains were scanned for activity. What the study revealed was that the part of the brain that responds to a physical threat also responds to an intellectual one. This area of the brain is known as the amygdala and is the emotional core of your mind. Unfortunately, it makes us biologically wired to react to threatening information the same way we'd react to being attacked by a predator. From an evolutionary standpoint, it makes sense. If you were a caveman and another caveman threw a boulder at your head, you wouldn't react biologically debating the pros and cons of getting brained. Core beliefs are the beliefs which people cherish the most deeply. They usually develop from childhood and are compounded by life experiences. Core beliefs are inflexible, rigid, and incredibly sensitive to being challenged. When I told you that George Washington's dentures were made from animal bones, it probably didn't ruffle many feathers. But when I suggested they were made from slave teeth, I'm guessing it caused strife with some of you. There are obvious cultural reasons for this. Slavery is a sensitive, hot-button issue. But there are biological reasons as well. The amygdala of your brain is screaming, "Battle stations!" Some of you may have held a worldview that George Washington was a patriot and a hero. By presenting negative information about him, it challenged that worldview. Your brain loves consistency. It builds a worldview like we build a house. It has a foundation and a frame and windows and doors, and it knows exactly how everything fits together. If a new piece is introduced and it doesn't fit, the whole house falls apart. Your brain protects you by rejecting that piece. It then builds a fence and a moat and refuses to let in any visitors. This is why we have the backfire effect. It's a biological way of protecting a worldview. Just remember that your worldview isn't a perfect house that was built to last forever. It's a cheap condo, and over time, most of it will fall apart. So, what do we do about this? Some of you have probably been nodding along in agreement, waiting for me to deliver a series of clever, combative ways to offset the backfire effect. The disappointing truth is that I don't have much advice for you. I don't have a way to change the behavior of 7.5 billion people carrying their beliefs around like precious gems wrapped in hand grenades. Sure, there are ways of changing people's minds that are more effective than others, but ultimately they all fall short. This is compounded by the internet, where anything can be cited as a source and every disagreement degrades into a room full of orangutans throwing feces at one another. The best I can do is make you aware of it so you can identify the backfire effect in your own brain, which isn't easy. The mind can't separate the emotional cortex from the logical one, and one could argue that this emotional underbelly is what makes us human. But I would argue that it's also what makes us animals. I sometimes pretend the amygdala of my brain is my pinky toe. When a core belief is challenged, I imagine it yelling insane things at me. I let it yell. I let it have its moment. I let the emotional cortex fight its little fight, and then I listen, and then I change. Because this universe of ours is so achingly beautiful. And blended together. We're all going the same direction. I'm not here to take control of the wheel or tell you what to believe. I'm just here to tell you that it's okay to stop, to listen, to change.
Okay, so the reason I like this video is that it kind of sums up what it's like to start looking at our grading practice. Remember in the book, he talked about this web of belief that we have as teachers. And I know for me, as I started to reconsider grading practices, as I started to learn about it, I felt that backfire effect because some of the things I was trying were really challenging what I believed at my core. And then I went back to my old ways. And then I tried again. And so sometimes I slipped back and moved forward. And it's a process, it's ongoing learning to change. And I had to let myself feel scared to try things and backtrack and then try again. And I think that's also helps us understand our colleagues who we really want to change, who maybe aren't ready to listen. They too are experiencing that amygdala going crazy when we challenge the way that they're doing their grading. So we've got to slow it down a little bit. And I think the most important thing that we have to do first is start with ourselves. And we have to really gain a strong understanding within our own classrooms, within our own beliefs of what we may think to be different. And then, so I'm changing. These are things I started to do. I started to question my grading practices. I started to kind of de-emphasize grades little at a time, little by little. I started to do my own research, both in class with my students, some action research, and reading more and more experts And slowly, this didn't happen fast because I felt that backfire effect happening. I'm beginning to address the grading elephant with others. It is easier to do here with you sometimes than it is to do with some of my colleagues at my own school. But I learned that I had to understand myself and what I was doing within my own classroom first before I could really start to share with others. So don't feel you have to go change others. It really has to start with you. When you are feeling more comfortable, when you are ready, that's when it's time to share what you're doing and thinking with others, or if you have colleagues that you're working with. An easy way to do this, like if you're not so sure about yourselves, I think that sharing Feldman's book is a great way, or any other book about grading is a great way to get someone else to think about it. For me, last year, I shared this book with Morgan. I shared this book with my principal, and both of them saw something in and decided to take it somewhere. Morgan's taken this idea of doing these book studies. We did one in the summer together, and now we're doing this one. And that is impacting others and maybe making small to bigger changes. Here at my own school, my principal bought the book for our leadership team, and we started to look at it as a book group. And then slowly, thanks to the pandemic, we're starting to look at those practices even more. Another thing that we have put together, I'm gonna change what I'm looking at, is there's a link that Morgan's going to put in the chat and send out tomorrow. That what we've put together is a list of resources. There are a lot of books out there about grading practices, standard-based grading, equitable, how to be more equitable with kids, some brand new ones that are coming out. Thanks to two other colleagues I'm going to introduce to you in a minute, we put together our resources, just 3 of us. And I think it was Bill O'Brien, one of our webinar participants, who suggested we create a resource that people can add to. So you're going to get this link, and it's an editable resource. You can see people popping where anyone can add in a new book, so we see the tabs down here. We've got books, we've got articles, we've got podcasts, we've got blogs. So anything that you read or listen to or review that you want to add to this list, please do, because this is a nice resource for you and your learning, and to find some things that you can share with others too. Phew. So closing up, getting to the end here. I want to share a quote with you, and then we're gonna do some closing details. This is really a quote that's carried me through in work that I've done throughout my life. To never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. We are committed citizens looking at equitable grading practices right now, and you will contribute to making change for yourself and others. And